just talk, as you do in the book, about this, least worst kind of scenario in the midst of a genocide, which you kind of eviscerate. Talk about that argument that, we can't, of course, too late now, but we can't not vote for Harris because we'll get Trump.
Yeah, I mean, this, I think, for me, dates back to my earliest memories of growing up in the Arab world. I almost universally am not a huge fan of any of the governments of the Arab world or any of the governing organizations in the Arab world. And a big part of, from a young age, looking towards the West for something, that something was almost always a negative space. It wasn't what it offered, it was what I didn't have to deal with. And so, you could talk about politics without worrying about the secret police coming to get you, or that there were underlying principles of free speech and equal justice and so on and so forth. But they were all relative to the place I grew up in. And so you come to this part of the world, and I think that there's a kind of stickiness to that initial impulse that causes you to constantly think of things in terms of what is the least worst option here. Which, to be perfectly honest with you, this is how I behaved for most of my life. There have been several elections where I looked at the ballot and saw an R next to somebody's name and voted for whoever the hell had the best chance against that R. I think one of the things that became really clear over the last year and change is that for some people there is a hard line after which I can no longer do that. After which this idea of relative evil is consumed by absolute evil. And for me, and for I think a lot of people, a genocide is that point. Over the last year, I have become conditioned that whenever I see a picture of a smiling child on my social media feed, that is probably there because that child has just been murdered, dismembered, or is starving to death. I cannot go from that mode just as a human being, just as somebody with a soul, and I'm sure your listeners will disagree with me on a million political points, but setting all of that aside, just as a human being, I cannot go from that to voting for an administration that would allow or bankroll or cheerlead for this and say to myself that, well, at least I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. I know the Trump administration is evil. I know Republican politics has become a kind of deranged fascist cult. I get all of this. But at some point, you have to decide what the hell it means to you to be human. And for me, I cannot continue to think of myself as human and then casually vote for somebody who would allow something like this to happen. And I've lost friends over this, and I can see where they're coming from, right? I had a friend who talked about this idea of, we need to vote for Harris and then push her on Gaza and then push her on climate change and then do all of this stuff. And I thought, if that works for you, fantastic. Do your thing, I guess. But also, I'm not 100% sure that you're going to be pushing for any of this stuff. I think that you're either horrified by what has happened, or you're not. And if you're not, that's okay. That's your life. But we are on opposite ends of a chasm. And it precludes me from voting for this person.
You describe it, I think, the words you use are theft of your soul. That's right. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
It's the theft of your soul.
We can have a political argument about almost anything. And I will compromise and I will find common ground and all the rest of it. But there's certain points where, no, I'm not going to do that. I understand that Trump might be a million times worse on every facet of foreign and domestic governance. I'm not going to put my name in alignment with somebody who allowed the last year to happen. I'm just not.
I just have to read this, even though it doesn't, because I thought it was great. You're quoting the Palestinian America poet, Noor Hindi. She says, I want to be like those poets who care about the moon. And the name of the poem is titled F Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying.
Yep. It's become one of my go-to poems over the years.
Isn't that great? You write, the problem with fixating on the abyss into which one's opponent has descended while simultaneously digging one's own, is that eventually it gets too dark to tell the difference. Explain what you mean by that.
I think one of the sort of hallmarks of Republican politics over the last 20 years is that you could safely go back a decade or so and take any piece of ideology or policy proposal that was previously on the fringe, and now it will be in the center, now it will be in the mainstream. Um, and that kind of derangement has been ongoing for a very long time. Um, and I think instead of sort of standing in opposition to that, there has been an impulse within mainstream progressive liberal democratic circles to sort of present oneself as a kind of endless centrist. I'm high-minded, I'm above it all, I find the center position, and that's the correct one to take. And I think at some point everybody in the right wing realized that you could take advantage of this and just push things further to the right, further towards fascism. And these very same people will gladly move further to the right alongside you because they want to remain in the center. It's just that the center keeps changing. Um, I've heard variations of this argument in every part of the world. You know, we need to keep this autocracy or this dictator in place because the alternative is Islamic fundamentalists and this. Sure, okay, I don't want that, fine. But at some point, if you're constantly tethering yourself to this idea of being slightly better than what's assumed to be the worst thing, you must be cognizant of what direction you're headed. Which is, I mean, I think something that the Democratic Party, despite their every effort, is going to have to contend with at some point. I don't need you to be half as tough on migrants as the Republicans are, because the Republicans are just going to get tougher on migrants and you will have to move your position, and it is indistinguishable from having no position at all. I don't need you to be that. I need you to stand for something. And I think this idea of tethering yourself to being slightly less evil than the most evil thing essentially becomes indistinguishable from that over time.
Yeah, that's precisely what happened. The Democratic Party transformed itself into the Republican Party, certainly begun by Clinton, and the Republican Party became a cultish, insane movement embracing magical thinking. But you're exactly right. It also happened in Israel, by the way, where lived in Israel when they outlawed the Koch party in Meir Kahane. And now people running Israel are all the heirs of Kahane. This is this radical racist rabbi.